Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, how the pending sale of an historic federal building by Trump could mean the loss of priceless New Deal art.
One preservationist I spoke to, founder of a group called the Living New Deal, calls the Cohen Building the Sistine Chapel of New Deal art. And it's for sale. Trump is determined to sell it by the end of 2025. There is no evidence that any effort is being made to preserve the building or to preserve the artworks therein.
Our guest is Timothy Noah, staff writer for The New Republic and a contributing editor to the Washington Monthly. He recently wrote a two-part series on the art that's now in jeopardy. Hey, Tim, it's great to see you again.
Hey, Ann, good to see you. And good to see you, Garrett.
Same here.
Tim, you recently wrote a two-part series about some masterpieces of American art that I think very few Americans actually even know existed, and that could soon disappear without a trace thanks to Donald Trump. So can you tell us, to start, where is this art and what's going on?
The art is in a building called the Wilbur Cohen Federal Building, and it is a building that was built by Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal, and it was built to house the Social Security Administration, then called the Social Security Board. It actually peculiarly never ended up housing the Social Security Board. Since that was the intention, it was loaded up with all sorts of very inspirational art about the mission of this new thing, Social Security. And the signature piece of art in there is a series of frescoes by Shahn, who was his star has faded a little bit, but he was a great artist who was highly, highly celebrated in the last century. And he produced what he himself described as some of the best work of his career. Really beautiful frescoes, which I guess we'll see in a moment. And there's also art by Philip Guston, who is another kind of well-known painter from that period. The National Gallery of Art just a couple of years ago had a big exhibition of, it's very ironic, they had a big exhibition a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, hardly anybody knew that hiding behind a blue curtain 2 blocks to the south was this really lovely Guston mural that he painted for the then Social Security building. And there are also notable artworks by others. One preservationist I spoke to, founder of a group called the Living New Deal, calls the Cohen Building the Sistine Chapel of New Deal art. And it's for sale. Trump is determined to sell it by the end of 2025. There is no evidence that any effort is being made to preserve the building or to preserve the artworks therein. And the staff at the General Services Administration, who ordinarily would be in charge of making sure these things get attended to, they were all laid off by DOJ last winter. A few of them have trickled back, but it's not clear they have the capability or will be allowed the capability by the White House. I think the GSA itself has, the voters' best interests, the public's best interests at heart here, but I don't know that they will be allowed to do their job, as is so often the case under Donald Trump.
Well, Tim, there's a background here that I was familiar with because of my generation. I grew up hearing my parents talking about the WPA and the WPA Artist Project. I knew older writers who worked for it. But tell our listeners a little bit about the background that this whole school of public art comes out of.
Right. Well, these particular artworks were not produced by the WPA, but there were several different programs in the federal government at the time to sponsor public art. And the WPA art program did sort of produce all sorts of fantastic art, a lot of it in Washington, all across the country. And they, in all of the arts, writers were supported by the WPA. There were a number of guides that were produced to the states that were produced, that were written by, subsequently famous writers like John Cheever and others. And there was theater. Orson Welles had a theater project that was supported by the WPA. He put on a an all-black production of Macbeth that was supported by the WPA. So yes, there was an ethos of artists have to work too, and everybody was out of work. Artists were suffering along with everybody else, and so there was a push to support artists. The murals in the Cohen Building arose from a related ethos, which was that our public buildings ought to have beautiful art that celebrated working people, as all of these murals do. So there was a lot of non-WPA public art in Washington and elsewhere. And it's all tracked very carefully by a wonderful organization, a nonprofit based in Berkeley called the Living New Deal. They actually crowdsource it. There's so much of this stuff that they had the ingenious idea of crowdsourcing, having people all over the country identify, particularly in post offices, of course, lots of WPA art in post offices. And they have on their website a map of, where these projects are all over the country, and they are attempting to preserve them wherever possible.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about the artist, Ben Shahn, that you write about in your piece? You said his star has dimmed a little bit, but it was very bright at one point. But for the benefit of younger generations, tell us, he has a really fascinating story.
He was he was out of the school of social realism, which sort of became acquired currency in the sort of teens and 20s and 30s and 40s. And in the 50s, it was eclipsed, especially in New York, by abstract expressionism. And there was a kind of growing feeling, not only in fine art, but also in the other arts, that there was a move away from what was seen as didacticism and towards abstraction. But Shahn, I think we're starting to see a Shahn revival. There's a wonderful retrospective in New York at the Jewish Museum that's on until October 26th of Shahn's work. And he started out doing a lot of paintings about Sacco and Vanzetti, who were two anarchists who were found guilty of having killed a murder that they almost certainly did not commit, and they were executed. We're coming up, I think next year is the centenary of their death, and interesting if we see some. It was a huge deal at the time. It became a huge cause célèbre among progressives around the country, and Shahn got caught up in that and did some really sort of wonderful paintings, very angry paintings. And he persisted in this kind of social realist style through the 30s. He did a lot of work for the federal government. I think he did do some work not for the WPA, but for the Farm Security Administration, which had its own sort of photography project, and he did a lot of photographs for them. He also did a lot of poster art. He was a painter, but he was also a graphic artist, and he kind of spilled over from the academy into doing popular works in the 50s. Ironically, he was a big lefty, but in the 50s, we had a very different corporate culture in the 1950s, and he was commissioned to do a lot of work for corporations, all, presenting this sort of political or humanist kind of message to the public. He did graphic art for labor unions. He did some work for the Office of War Information during World War II, but in the his star did sort of start to fade a bit, and so you don't hear as much about him from about the 70s going forward. But as I say, I think he's coming back. He was the first artist ever asked to deliver the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. And those lectures were just republished by Harvard University Press with a lovely introduction by Adam Gopnik, who said, we really are due for a revival.
He was kind of the Zelig of American art there for a period of time. As you note, this very seminal photography work that he was involved with. He ended up working with Diego Rivera when Rivera came to New York to work on the Rockefeller Building.
That's a wild story in itself. You should tell that story. Yeah, the Nelson Rockefeller, young heir to the Rockefeller fortune and a huge art enthusiast, worshipped Diego Rivera and hired him to do a mural for the lobby of the Rockefeller Center and 30 Rock. I think it was 30 Rock. And Diego does it, and then and Shahn was working on the project with Rivera, and he puts the portrait of Lenin in there. And Nelson Rockefeller says, "No, you can't have Lenin in there." And he says, "I'm not taking it out." So they destroyed this beautiful work of art by Diego. We could have had a beautiful Diego Rivera in Rockefeller Center, but they destroyed it.
No.
So yeah, he does pop up in all sorts of. I think CBS kind of had him. CBS had him doing some TV stuff as well. But he was very left. I mean, he in the 40s, he was anti-communist, but he was in the 40s. He was very much against Harry Truman and Dewey, and he did a famous poster of the two of them where Truman is playing the piano and Dewey is sort of leaning against it like a chanteuse. And, the idea is they're both sort of singing the same song. So you should vote for Henry Wallace, which in fact was not a very good idea. Anyway, but it's a beautiful piece of art nonetheless. And then later he got very concerned about the threat of nuclear war. And he did a great deal of work on that. And he also got a little bit into he was Jewish and got a little bit into Jewish mysticism in some of his later works. And he just had this very distinctive style, these kind of thick lines and these sort of very powerful stuff.
Well, let's just start to take a look at some of his art then. We've got a few of the pictures, in particular from the Cohen Building. And it's not just Ben Shahn's art that is in jeopardy. So as you go through the slideshow, Tim, if you will just kind of explain what we're looking at and the significance, in particular, like why Shahn decided to do this mural. So
yes, well, there are, and again, I'm describing now to you some art I have not seen myself. This all started out with me just trying as a civilian to get in to see the art, because I found out about it at this Ben Shahn exhibit in New York, and I couldn't get in. And then I found out, oh, the building is for sale. And I should say that the law to sell the building was passed at the end of the Biden administration. It was an amendment snuck into a water resources bill by Senator Joni Ernst. Now, why a senator from Kansas wanted to sell off a particular federal building, I'm sure there's a story there, probably not a very savory one, but it happened. The actual sale was passed by Congress in January. And at the same time, the GSA was preparing a very elaborate, ambitious, wonderful plan to refurbish the building. But we're getting back to the murals. Sorry, that was all a detour. I have not seen the murals, but as I understand it, there is one side of a hallway. It's a whole corridor. It's huge. One side of the hallway depicts life without Social Security, and that's where you see the guy with crutches and people suffering. And then the other side of the hallway is people thriving with Social Security through labor. It is very didactic. It is very 1930s, but it's also very beautiful, I think. The colors are just so vibrant, and it speaks to, I think what all three of us would agree was a truly glorious moment in American politics, where the federal government, in the person especially of Franklin Roosevelt, really revered the common man, and as opposed to the sort of posturing you see these days from MAGA types about the common man, portrayed as just someone who is perpetually angry at everything coming out of Washington and ungenerous. And this is the opposite. This is a very generous view of humanity, and it's it also bespeaks a humanism that is also sort of weirdly out of fashion today, but I think that's coming back.
And there are other artists there too. You mentioned in your piece a couple of friezes by someone else.
Yes, there were some friezes on the exterior of the building. I forget who the artist was there, but that these are all kind of allegorical. This one of them, you see the husband going off to work with his lunch pail, and yes, plucking fruit, sort of harvesting the fruits of his labors, and uh, I think there was another one that sort of shows the misery of unemployment, and it's very moving art. And I think a couple of them were done by a woman artist, and at a time when there were not a lot of women artists receiving public commissions like that. So this is all distinctive art. The building is loaded with distinctive art. It's also got some interesting historical aspects that are worth preserving. One of them is, well, I was talking to somebody at VOA. The Voice of America is headquarters there, or perhaps I should say was headquartered there, because Trump has now fired everybody who works for VOA. I think that will be challenged in court. But in any case, somebody who had worked at VOA said there are an unbelievable number of bathrooms. Can you guess why? And I said, I really can't guess why. And she said, because it was built when the civil service was still racially segregated. So you see 2 men's rooms side by side and 2 ladies' rooms side by side, and the same with water fountains. And, there's some value in preserving that architecture so you can sort of remember this happened, less than a century ago. They didn't desegregate the civil service until I think it was. And, that's meaningful history. But in any case, it's on a fast track. The building is on a fast track to be sold. It's a terrible time to be selling any large office building in Washington, D.C. We're still in the midst of a post-COVID slump in demand for commercial real estate. I think in that neighborhood, which is Southwest, you've got a vacancy rate of about 15%, and anything above 10% is bad. Plus, Trump is trying to sell like 4 buildings in Southwest all at the same time. This one and a Marcel Breuer building built for HUD and a couple of others. And they want to do it in 2025. Russell Vought is pushing hard on this, and it is stupid. It is, and the Cohen Building in particular, not only because of the art treasures, although that's the main reason to be concerned, but it's also situated in an absolutely ideal spot that any federal agency would kill for. It's across Independence Avenue from the National Museum of the American Indian, and it's 2 blocks west of the Capitol. That is prime real estate at a time when you've got a lot of agencies being pushed out to the suburbs because supposedly there's no place to put them in Washington, and that's just not true. But as I say, my main concern is the art, and I talked to one person who was one of the people who was fired at GSA, and he said, there's no way a private buyer is going to keep that building. It's too expensive to renovate. It hasn't been renovated since 1940. It's got an electrical vault that is an antique from the Great Depression. I mean, it was built in the 30s, and it's could go bluey anytime. And there are a million problems like that with the building. It would cost really more than the private sector can cough up to really preserve that building. So what does that mean? That means whoever wants to buy it is going to want to buy it and to tear it down and build, whatever on the mall. I imagine that there will be some restrictions on what you can build. It's not, on the mall itself, but it's across the street from the mall. And that whole area, I think, is protected by the National Capital Commission to some extent. But will the art be saved? I wouldn't count on it. They don't have the staff to deal with that. Also, the Shahn murals are, they are really big. It is going to be hard, and it's on the ground floor. So that is a difficult engineering task. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it would have to be done very expensively. We have an inkling of what Donald Trump's views of art preservation are from the famous Bonwit Teller story. I don't know if you know the story of when Trump was building Trump Tower in 1980. And Bonwit Tellers had its flagship store on Fifth Avenue, and it was being torn down to make way for Trump Tower. And the Metropolitan said, hey, Donald, do you think you could save these lovely bas-reliefs that are on there, kind of Art Deco bas-reliefs on the building? We'd like to have them. And he said, sure. And then, the day came when it was time to deal with this. And he said, oh, screw it. And he just demolished them because it was too much trouble. And that's the attitude. It's a familiar attitude. You're not surprised to hear this story.
Yeah.
He is indifferent. He doesn't keep his promises. He doesn't care about such matters. And as I say in my piece, these were bas-reliefs of lovely naked women. How do you think he's going to feel about, frescoes of sweaty, laboring masses? He's I think, not going to want to concern himself with that.
Could we sneak in and coat it with gold really quickly? Because then
I had the same thought. It's like, well, he's gilding the White House, and we gilded these frescoes.
Good plan. There are lovely brass railings in front of them to protect them. And but yeah, no, go a little gilt in there would be good. No, look, there's a lot going on right now. There's a lot for people to be concerned about, but this one, nobody else has written it except me. And I'm really trying to kind of get the word out to the rest of the press and also to preservationists, because I think unless some preservationist organization sues GSA demanding that they follow what relatively meager protections there are involved with regard to this art, then we're not going to see any effort made to preserve it. There is some court decisions, including one this year, that said New Deal art belongs to the public. It actually gets more protection than other public art, which is a little strange. Art that was built by the CETA program in the 70s doesn't get as much protection, but the New Deal art, for some reason, does. But we also know how Trump deals with court decisions.
And I can't help but think that there's some symbolism here with these, historic murals about Social Security that are being demolished by this administration as well. I mean, the One Big Beautiful Bill is in fact doing that in real life. I mean, the trust fund is going to go bankrupt 6 months earlier than planned. By 2034, we're going to be staring down some pretty significant cuts in Social Security. I mean, as life imitates art, right? Or vice versa.
That's right. And there's also if I may go on a Washington Monthly-esque, down a Washington Monthly-esque road, part of the story is just the screwy way the federal government handles its buildings, where almost every federal agency does not own its own building. The Pentagon does, but the Defense Department does, but most of them don't. And as a consequence, they pay rent to GSA. And so as a consequence, you have to have a big budget in order to maintain decent maintenance. It's sort of like in the private rental market, right? You get a cheap apartment, it's going to be maintained in a lousy way. You get an expensive apartment, at least theoretically, it's going to be maintained better. Since the 50s, the Cohen Building has been inhabited by the Voice of America, which has a tiny budget. And as a consequence, GSA has not spent a lot of money maintaining.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for telling us about this. And do you have any advice for ordinary citizens? Is there anything that we can do out here to try to save this art?
Talk to your congressman, I think, particularly DC preservation groups are going to have to be energized here and are going to have to take the Trump administration to court. Seems like everything Trump does requires a lawsuit, but this is another one. And there's a time consideration because they are trying to do this by the end of the year. They've already emptied out the building. There's nobody in the building, which is the first step towards putting it on the market. We could see a sale quite soon. Once a private owner owns, it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but once a private owner owns something on the National Register, he can demolish it. He has to give up certain tax breaks he would otherwise get, but if he gives those up, he's free to do whatever he wants with that building. So it's really up to the GSA to impose restrictions now, and best of all would be to cancel the sale. I mean, that's going to be harder because a law has already passed affecting it, but it was a bad decision.
Well, thank you, Tim, for joining us, and hope that this effort succeeds to save this art.
Thank you.
Take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, And on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.